we're talking about the Vietnam War. We got to go back. Remember, we're not doing so well. We had the Tet Offensive, got a lot of protests going on. Lyndon Johnson makes it public that he will not run for re-election. Richard Nixon runs. He's elected. He's going to bring an honorable end to the war. And he finally discloses his plan that he's going to gradually withdraw American troops out of Vietnam. And he's only going to fight on the defensive. Well, he kind of went against what he said, and that's what I mean by America's advancement into Cambodia. Now, Cambodia is a country that borders North Vietnam, okay? And what would North Vietnamese soldiers or military have to do with Cambodia? What might they be using Cambodia for, since it borders North Vietnam? Very good. They're storing their military supplies and equipment there out of sight of the Americans and the South Vietnamese. So in April of 1970, my God, kids, we've made it to 1970. In April of 1970, President Nixon sent 31,000 American troops into Cambodia. Now, this was that country that bordered North Vietnam. And he stated that we would be withdrawing troops, right? And we would fight only on the defensive. Now, his philosophy wasn't bad. The reason he sent these troops into Cambodia was to clear out these military supply centers that the North Vietnamese had set up in that country. He figured if we get their equipment and supplies destroyed, we might be able to end this thing a little better, okay? So he does probably what makes sense, but on the other hand, people are not expecting him to go on the offensive and go into another country, let alone be on the offensive in Vietnam. Well, this invasion of Cambodia, as Americans saw it, caused a storm of protest all over the country, especially on college campuses, okay? And probably the most famous protest to the events of Cambodia happened at Kent State University, which is in Ohio, on May 4th of 1970. So let me kind of reiterate that to you, give you a little time. In April of 1970, President Nixon sent 31,000 American troops into Cambodia, which is a country that borders North Vietnam. And the reason that he sent troops into Cambodia is he wanted to clear out those military supply centers that North Vietnam had set up in that country. And this invasion of Cambodia by American troops started a whole new storm of protests across the United States, especially on college campuses, and probably the most notable campus protest occurred at Kent State University in Ohio on May 4th, 1970. So let's just stay on this side of the handout I gave you, and we'll read through it, and then we'll turn it over. So stay on this side, okay? Okay, God, you know when I give you these, you know what it amounts to? Eventually it's going to be a Pulitzer Prize winning photograph, okay? So, John Philo. While I was a student at Kent State, I worked as a lab technician at the School of Journalism. That Monday morning, I opened up the lab about 8 a.m. This was after a nasty weekend, not just at Kent State, but all over the country. Most colleges and universities were erupting after Nixon's announcement of the Cambodian invasion. The National Guard had been called up on Saturday after the ROTC building was burned. At noon, we closed the lab down to go to the rally right outside the journalism building, Taylor Hall. When I got there, the guard and the students had confronted each other across the commons about 200 yards apart. Suddenly there was a series of tear gas barrages, and I was running back and forth between the two groups taking pictures of the conflict. The guardsmen lined up with fixed bayonets and made a sweep across the commons towards Taylor Hall. They didn't bother me, although I didn't give them a chance to get within striking distance of a nightstick. By following them, I ended up in the parking lot behind Taylor Hall. There were about 75 guardsmen helmeted and wearing black gas masks. They looked grotesque. After about 5 minutes, the guard started moving to the top of the hill. As they were moving back, the students followed them, keeping a distance of about 150 feet. The hostile body of the crowd was shouting and throwing rocks at the guard. I was jogging to get in position behind this group and the guardsmen in the background so I could show the relationship of the two and also to be close should anything happen. The guard was moving backward, dodging rocks. As they reached the crest of the hill, they turned suddenly, dropped to one knee, and began firing directly into the crowd. People started running in all directions. When the firing started, the people came roaring back down the sidewalk. It was a 2-foot drop from there down to the street, and if you're running and don't expect it, you could break a leg. So I was yelling at these people, "This is just a scare tactic." I could see no reason for these rifles to be pointing into the crowd and firing away unless they were using blanks. I was screaming, "Don't run, you're going to break your leg." I couldn't imagine live ammunition. I was standing up, dodging back and forth, grabbing these people as they ran by me. The firing was still going on. It seemed like an awfully long time. I raised the camera to my eye, got it focused on the guardsman shooting right at me. My finger is on the button, the shutter is on its way down, and in that moment I see over the right side of the viewfinder a bullet slam into a metal structure, going right through it and blasting a hole in a tree. The whole sculpture shook and a cloud of rust settled around it. I just dropped my camera and said, "My God, someone is firing real bullets." I thought someone had made a mistake. When the firing stopped, there were people laying all over the grass. I'm the only one standing up on the sidewalk. There was an officer out in front of the guardsmen with his hands up and telling them to stop shooting. As I turned around directly over my left shoulder, I saw the body of Jeff Miller. He had been shot in the neck. It could only have been a few seconds, but already the blood was extensive, like kicking over a bucket of blood. With the realization they were firing live ammunition, I said, "This is crazy. I've got to get out of here," and started walking away. I think I took 3 steps and said, "Wait a minute, someone's got to document this." I turned back around. Wounded and dying people are lying all around me. Other people are pulling themselves up off the ground. No one is going near the body. And then this girl, Marianne Beccacho, comes running up the street and she kneels down beside the body. I started walking toward her. Her body was shaking. She was crying, and then she screamed, a god-awful scream. My reflexes took over, and that was it, one frame. After it was all over and the university was closed, I took it upon myself to get the pictures out. The biggest thing with me was that I didn't think people would believe what had happened. It seemed so unreal. You have to understand that at this time I was very paranoid about what was going to happen. I didn't know if someone was going to stop me and take my film away. I was trying to get this film into my pocket, and I was thinking about hiding it in my Volkswagen until I got to Pennsylvania. I really thought someone had blundered in killing these people and there was going to be a mass cover-up. Already the radio reports were saying 2 guardsmen and only 2 students were killed. Everybody was shocked at the false reports. They weren't telling what really happened. As I was driving to Pennsylvania, I began to wonder if I had really had the photographs or not. I said to myself, I think I remember seeing it happen, and I think I remember photographing it, but I'm not sure. Because I was so frightened, I can remember the camera to my eye, but I was trying to remember whether the shutter was going off. It was such an intense thing. I was lucky. There were people killed on both sides of me. I don't know how I escaped without being hit. It's something I'll always be thankful for. The girl in the photo, Marianne Beccacho, was not a student at Kent State. She turns out to be a 14-year-old runaway from Florida, just drifting through campus on this day. Jeff Miller wasn't a radical or leader. In fact, he was not politically active. He liked playing drums. He wore his hair long, was shy of girls, and was concerned about social problems. He felt angered and betrayed by the Cambodian invasion. The students told that Kent State stands at 4 dead and 5 badly wounded. Among the guardsmen, 1 man was injured on the arm by a rock. Now, that's the events at Kent State. You can see the girl. This is a Pulitzer Prize winning photograph. Well, this caused a storm you wouldn't believe. And after these events that we just read about at Kent State, the Senate voted to repeal the Gulf of Tonkin resolution.
Wasn't that like in the 1800s?
Yeah, no, the Gulf of Tonkin.
That was
yeah.
very shitty, right?
So after the events at Kent State, the Senate finally voted to repeal the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, the resolution that gave Lyndon Johnson war-making powers in Vietnam despite no declaration of war. It happened in 1964. So it took them 6 years, almost 7 years to repeal that. Well, in late June of 1970, about 6 weeks after the Kent State incident, Nixon took all troops out of Cambodia. It was not a popular thing. Wow.
Just Cambodia?
just like brought him out of Cambodia and began to continue his philosophy.
And
But he
when
got
was
him
that?
out of Cambodia in late June. Because of the heat he was taking, he took him out. Now, did he have the right idea in a lot of ways? Yeah, but it wasn't it was just a bad thing. Okay? I'm gonna tell you a very interesting story. One of my prized autographs in this room has to do with Kim's story. Kim's story. This is a great story, but sad. One of my prized autographs, one of the most rare signatures I have.
What is the most rare signature?
I would say the Marina Oswald Porter, but this one has to rank right up. It took a lot for me to get this one. On June 8th of 1972, a tiny village called Trang Bang was occupied by North Vietnamese forces. On June 8th of 1972, a tiny village called Trang Bang was occupied by North Vietnamese forces. Remember, they're the bad guys. Because this village was occupied by North Vietnamese forces, the South Vietnamese 25th Army Division was called in and heavy bombing began. As a result of the North Vietnamese occupying Trang Bang on June 8th of 1972, the South Vietnamese 25th Army Division was called into Trang Bang and heavy bombing began. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, the South Vietnamese Army dropped 4 drums of napalm on the village of Trang Bang. 4 drums of napalm, that's a dose. 4 55-gallon drums of napalm on the village. Remember what that is? What is napalm? What does it do? Sticky jelly type stuff. Very good. 9-year-old Kim Phuc tore off her clothes and ran naked down a road in the village, screaming in agony from the gelled gasoline that was coating her body and burning through her skin and muscle all the way down to the bone. She tore her clothes off because her clothes had this stuff on it. And she tore them off thinking that it would help. Well, it got on her skin. So 9-year-old Kim Phuc ran naked down a road in the village, screaming in agony from the gelled gasoline that was coating her body and burning through her skin and muscle, all the way to the bone. 2 of her infant brothers were killed instantly when the napalm was dropped. 2 of her infant brothers were killed instantly as a result of the napalm. This is what she later remembered. You don't have to write this down, just listen. This is what she later said. I saw the bombs. I saw the fire. There was a terrible heat. I tore off my burning clothes, but the burning didn't stop. People poured water over me with their canteens. Then I fainted. An Associated Press photographer by the name of Nick Ut captured these horrific moments. An Associated Press photographer, Nick Ut, captured these horrific moments. He took the picture that I'll show you in a bit. He also drove Kim to the hospital, continued to visit her in the hospital, brought her books and gifts, and eventually set up a fund for donations to her family. This Associated Press photographer, Nick Ut, captured these horrific moments on film. He then drove Kim to the hospital. He continued to visit with her in the hospital through the next many days. He would bring her books and gifts, and he eventually set up a fund for donations to her family. Well, that photograph that you see above the G.I. Joes, which was snapped of her agony, was transmitted all around the world, eventually winning a Pulitzer Prize. Now, I had to go through a guy, through a guy, through a guy, but if you look up at this, June 8th, 1972, signed by Kim Fu. And there, as you can see, the little girl running naked down the streets of Trang Bang.
How'd you do that?
Well,
Guy through a guy.
I went through a media guy who knew another media guy who knew this Nick Oot, who got an address and just sent a letter. Now, Kim would spend the next 14 months in the hospital, covered with third-degree burns over half of her body. She would spend the next 14 months in the hospital, covered with third-degree burns over half her body. She was not expected to live. Her pain was almost unbearable. She was not expected to live, as her pain was unbearable. Let's see if I can find something over there. Her surgeon, Dr. Mark Gorney of San Francisco, was a volunteer at the Children's Plastic Surgery Hospital in Saigon. He had left his position in San Francisco and gone to Vietnam to work at a plastic surgery hospital in Saigon. When he first saw her, kiddos, Kim's chin was welded to her chest by scar tissue. Her chin had stuck to her chest, and her left arm was almost burnt to the bone. So when he first treated her, her chin was basically welded to her chest with scar tissue, and her left arm was burned to the bone. It would eventually take 17 operations to save her life. 17 operations to save her life. I had a picture of her one time. She's still alive today, obviously, but she still has the visible burns on her body from that. But that was a Pulitzer. But that gives you an idea. Now, when I get into this tragic end and all, you'll see how civilians were affected. Okay, and she's a civilian. Okay. All right, that'll take us to our next subtopic, which is the ceasefire agreement. We're going to come up with a ceasefire agreement in Vietnam. Ceasefire agreement. Finally, on January 27th of 1973, a ceasefire agreement was reached in Vietnam. January 27th, 1973. A ceasefire agreement was reached in Vietnam.
Wait, where's Kim now?
I'm not sure where she lives at this present time. I think California. But she's just trying to live on normal life. You could probably Google it, and find some information. Now, here's what this agreement stated. 3 things that this agreement stated when the ceasefire was reached in Vietnam. Number 1, the agreement allowed the continued presence of North Vietnamese forces in South Vietnam. It allowed the continued presence of North Vietnamese forces in South Vietnam. So basically it's saying that North Vietnamese military can be in South Vietnam. Second thing, the agreement, it assured that South Vietnam would have a government of its own choosing. It assured South Vietnam would have a government of its own choosing. And the third thing this agreement did is it guaranteed that the United States would continue to give economic and military aid to South Vietnam. It guaranteed that the United States would continue to give economic and military aid to South Vietnam. So, the agreement, which was signed on January 27th of 1973, allowed the continued presence of North Vietnamese forces in South Vietnam, assured that the South Vietnam would have a government of its own choosing, and it guaranteed that the United States would continue to give economic and military aid to South Vietnam. When all parties signed this ceasefire agreement, President Nixon then withdrew the remaining American troops in Vietnam. And also part of that agreement is all prisoners of war were scheduled to be released. Didn't always happen. You watch any of these missing in actions by Chuck Norris on TV, they're all about that. How many prisoners of war they had to go back and get, which was fictional, his anyway, but it was, they weren't all released.
Why?
Now, this is an interesting story when we get to the Vietnam War, a tragic end. Because you got to picture this in your mind. I really just kind of want you to listen to this, and then we'll go back and figure it out a little bit later. Finally, in late April of 1975, because it was agreed upon that the North Vietnamese could have a military presence in South Vietnam, right? Seoul, which was the capital of South Vietnam, was surrounded by North Vietnamese military. So by late April of 75. Now, if you're an American soldier, and if you're a South Vietnamese civilian that worked for the United States government, what would you want to do about the time